reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. He spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva and smeared the clay on his eyes and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back able to see. His neighbors and those who had seen him earlier as a beggar said, "Isn't this the one who used to sit and beg?" Some said it is, but others said, "No, he just looks like him." He said, "I am." They brought the one who was once blind to the Pharisees. Now Jesus had made clay and opened his eyes on a Sabbath. So then the Pharisees also asked him how he was able to see. He said to them, "He put clay in my eyes, and I washed, and now I can see." So some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a sinful man do such signs?" And there was division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you have to say about him, since he opened your eyes?" He said, "He is a prophet." They answered him and said to him, "You were born totally in sin, and are you trying to teach us?" Then they threw him out. When Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, he found him and said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered and said, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." He said, "I do believe, Lord," and he worshiped him. The Gospel of the Lord. Entrance Day, and I remember it as if it were yesterday. Entrance Day, of course, being the day that I left all my worldly possessions, except for 2 suitcases, and I entered the Jesuit novitiate in Culver City. The novitiate is the first stage of formation for all Jesuits. My parents, along with my sister and her family, they dropped me off, and it was kind of like moving into your college dorm as a freshman at 30 this time. So it was kind of strange, but at the same time, I was very happy to be there. The novitiate was a very formative experience, full of growth and full of change, and with plenty of stories I have that I can prove it with. And I think that's pretty true for many Jesuits who entered the novitiate. For their experience there, they also had lots of change and lots of growth and lots of stories as well. I'm sure Fathers Jack and JT, they can regale you with many stories, edifying and also maybe a little bit embarrassing. But stories were actually central to novitiate life. Central. Our vocation story, how we ended up becoming Jesuits, how God called us to become a Jesuit, what our calling was like. And actually, the very next day after Entrance Day, we were invited to share that story, our vocation story, with the other Jesuits with whom we entered with. And throughout the course of those 2 years of novitiate life, I and the other Jesuits, we would share that story many, many times over and over again with many different people, many different institutions. And I recall, and thinking about it now, every time I shared that story, my vocation story, something special happened. Something really special happened. Stories, there's something about stories. And more than just something to entertain us with, we know they're entertaining. This whole town was built on telling stories. But more importantly, stories teach us something. They teach us something. And the characters in the story, the great stories, enable us to connect with the characters. They enable us to put ourselves in their shoes. And therefore, we can see that we're not alone in our struggles, and they also teach us something about life. That's why Jesus, the greatest storyteller of all time, was always teaching with stories and parables, but not only to entertain, not only to enlighten and teach, but also to entertain, just like Hollywood in a sense. Today's gospel story is about a story, and that story belongs to this blind man. And it's about his encounter with Jesus. And he goes off and he tells his story over and over and over again. And every time he tells his story, something special happens. Now, there were 2 versions of today's gospel story, the long version and the short version. And I opted to read the short version because if I had read the long version, I'd be halfway through it right now, and you guys would be on your feet still. So you can thank me later for reading the shorter version. But I tell you that because I'm going to mention some things in this story which you guys did not hear, and if you guys want to, after Mass today, you guys can go back and revisit that story. But today's gospel story is all about his story. So what happens? Well, he has this encounter with Jesus. Jesus rubs mud on his eyes. Then he goes to the pool of Siloam to go wash it off. And afterwards, he's cleansed. He's healed. He's changed. He can see. And the first thing that he does, he goes and shares his story with his neighbors. Tells them every little detail, exactly what happened. And then when they ask him, well, who did this to you? The blind man, the previously blind man says, oh, it was that man Jesus that did it. That man Jesus, he's the one that did it. So these neighbors, they're amazed, and they want him to tell his story, share his stories with the religious authorities. So he goes to the Pharisees, and he shares his story with the Pharisees. And he tells them the exact same story, all the details, how Jesus rubbed mud on his eyes, and then he can see after washing the pool of Siloam. The same story. Except afterwards, when they ask him, well, who did this? His story changes. He says, it was that prophet Jesus. So the Pharisees are very skeptical because they have to keep the Sabbath, and he didn't do this on the Sabbath. So they bring him to his parents to ask him if he was really born blind since birth. So again, he has to reflect on his story and share his story. So again, he tells the same story over again with all the same details, the mud, the saliva, the pool. But then when they ask him, well, who did this to you? Again, his story changes a little bit. He says, well, it was that man from God. It was that man from God that did it. So we see in the 3 times that he told his story, first it was that man, then it was that prophet, then it was that man from God who did it. And afterwards, we hear in today's story, that afterwards he calls Jesus Lord, and then he worships him. So we can see that each time he told his story, his understanding, his faith, his love of Jesus, his relationship with Jesus changed. It matured. It grew. It basically went from nothing to calling him Lord and worshiping him. It's an important thing to note. Every time he told this story, there was a progression in his understanding of who Jesus was. Then the second thing that's important to note from this story after every time he told the story, well, we see it the very first time. So the very first time he tells the story to those neighbors, and then after hearing the story, the neighbors say, well, where is he? Where is this Jesus? What's important to note here is that after telling his story, these neighbors become inspired. They become interested. They become curious. They too want to know, they want to meet Jesus. They want to know who he is. They had seen the change in this blind man, and they want change themselves. They want to experience. They want that encounter. Now, of course, there's not always success in this sense. The story isn't always welcome to all people because he tells that same story to the Pharisees, and they refuse to believe it. They refuse to acknowledge it. Ironically, they're the ones that become blinded. They can't see God at work in this miracle. And they're blinded by distrust. They're blinded by their own desire to hold on to the religious power. They're blinded by all these other factors that don't allow them to see. But it's important to note that when he does share his story, those 2 things, his faith, his relationship with Jesus deepens, and he's able to inspire others, introducing others to get to know who Jesus is. So what does that mean for us 2,000 years ago here in Hollywood? Well, all of us are like this blind man. All of us should be able to identify with this blind man. Blindness being symbolic of any type of injury or ailment or hurt or wound that we have had, that we have carried. And after an encounter with Jesus, we too have been healed. we too have been cured. We too have changed. And when I say encounter with Jesus, I'm not saying that it has to have been some sort of mystical experience, like the transfiguration, the reading that we read a few weeks ago, where Jesus was glowing. Jesus manifests himself in many different ways. Your encounter with Jesus could have been as simple as experiencing the loving touch or the loving action of some other person who did something for you. That could easily have been your encounter with Jesus. And similarly enough, you probably didn't even realize that God was behind that action. But I guarantee you, if you look at your story and you reflect on it and you retell it over and over again, you'll see God's hand at work in that. That's exactly what happened to this blind man. He had no idea who Jesus was. He called him that man. But after reflecting on his story, after telling it over and over again, he eventually realized, he was able to see that Jesus, that God, was behind that story the whole time. He was behind it the whole time. All of you have stories. All of you have stories, and therefore we must be like that blind man and share that story so that we too can deepen our relationship with Jesus, and also so that we can inspire others to get to know who Jesus is and have that same type of change. Now, of course, there is that temptation to say, I don't have a story, or my story doesn't matter, my story's not important. All of those are lies that keep all of you and us blinded to the reality that Jesus is always working within us. And it keeps us from sharing our stories and bringing sight to this world that walks in darkness. So all of you have a story. I'm looking around at all of your faces, and there's hundreds of stories behind that. And using your stories and telling your stories can give sight to this world that is blind. All you have to do is share those stories. Today, we continue on in our preaching series entitled, Wait, What? And it's all about digging into the scriptures and trying to figure out what's going on in these stories that we're reading. But more importantly, what do they mean for us? Well, today's gospel story, it's all about your story. It's all about your story and how you have to share your story. By sharing your story, you will deepen your relationship with God and you will inspire others to follow him as well. And the best part about it is that by sharing your story, by following Jesus, by the time you get to the final chapter of your story, it'll be better than a Hollywood ending. So share your story and share it often.